Software supply chain risk often feels abstract until a new library bug hits the news and everyone starts asking the same question: are we affected? You see tickets flying around, people dumping scan results into chat, and still no one can say with confidence which applications actually depend on that library. That is the moment when a clear inventory of what is inside your software stops being a nice idea and becomes a survival tool. This insight is part of the Tuesday Insights feature from Bare Metal Cyber Magazine, developed by Bare Metal Cyber, and it focuses on how a software bill of materials, SBOM, can give you that clarity. A software bill of materials is basically a parts list for software. Instead of bolts and bearings, it lists the libraries, frameworks, open source components, and other pieces that make up an application or service. For a working security or IT professional, that list is what turns vague concern about our dependencies into a concrete picture of what you actually run. When dependency chains are visible, software supply chain risk starts to look less like a fog and more like a map that you can navigate.
In practice, an SBOM is not just a security document. It is a shared artifact that sits between development, operations, and security. Developers care because it reflects the building blocks they chose. Operations teams care because it describes what is really running on their platforms. Security teams care because it helps them understand where known vulnerabilities might land. You can think of the SBOM as a common language that lets these groups talk about the same software in precise terms, instead of trading product names and guesses.
An SBOM is also more of a format and a process than a single tool. Build systems, code repositories, and scanning tools work together to identify components and record details like version numbers and suppliers. Those details are then packaged into a structured document that other tools can read. In many environments, SBOM documents are linked to asset inventories, vulnerability scanners, and change records. That linkage is what lets you move from a public advisory about a library to a list of specific services and hosts that rely on it.
It is just as important to be clear about what an SBOM is not. It is not a vulnerability scanner that probes running systems. It is not a full license compliance report, even though it can help with that. It is not a magic supply chain security in a box product that fixes everything on its own. An SBOM does not patch outdated components or redesign unsafe architectures by itself. What it does is answer the basic question, what is where, with enough detail that other processes, like patching and risk assessment, can act intelligently.
When you zoom out, SBOM documents live inside a wider software supply chain story. They work best when combined with secure build pipelines, code signing, and clear release processes. They strengthen vendor risk management when suppliers are willing to share their own SBOM information. They also rely on a steady flow of vulnerability intelligence that can be matched to the components listed in each SBOM. Seen in that light, SBOM practice is one important building block in a broader effort to understand how software flows from open source projects and commercial vendors into your environment.
To see how SBOM fits into day-to-day work, it helps to follow it from creation to use. In a typical modern environment, an SBOM starts its life in the build pipeline. As developers push code and the pipeline runs, tools examine the source, the package manifests, and often the compiled artifacts. They identify libraries and components in use, record version numbers, and attach identifiers that other tools can understand. The outcome is a structured document that describes the internal ingredients of that particular build of the software. Once created, that SBOM document needs a home and a purpose. Many teams store it in an artifact repository or a dedicated SBOM platform next to the application it describes. From there, other systems can consume it. A vulnerability management tool can match components from the SBOM against public advisories, so you know exactly which applications are touched when a new issue appears. An asset or configuration database can tie a given SBOM to the services, hosts, or containers where that software runs.
Change managers can look at how the component list shifts between releases and ask why a new dependency has been added or an old one removed. A concrete example brings this to life. Imagine a customer portal that uses several open-source frameworks. Every time you cut a new release of the portal, the build pipeline generates an SBOM and stores it alongside the release artifact. A few months later, a critical vulnerability is announced in one of those frameworks. Instead of searching codebases by hand or scanning everything in a panic, your vulnerability tooling queries the stored SBOM documents and flags that the portal depends on the affected version. Tickets open for the owning team, which can confirm impact, plan a fix, and record what they did, all while referencing the specific component entry in the SBOM. Underneath this smooth response is a big assumption. The SBOM is accurate, somebody owns it, and the surrounding processes are real.
In everyday work, SBOM information shows its value when it supports specific tasks rather than sitting on a shelf. A very common use is faster impact analysis when new vulnerabilities appear. Instead of starting from a vague advisory and asking, "Does this affect us?" teams with SBOM coverage search directly for the vulnerable component across their key applications. They can see which systems rely on it, how exposed those systems are, and which teams own them. Impact assessment moves from guesswork to a targeted list of actions.
SBOM practice also changes how you talk with vendors and third parties. When a supplier provides an SBOM for their product, your security and procurement teams can see whether it ships with outdated or risky components. They can see whether the product leans heavily on a single ecosystem or includes components that your policies restrict. This does not mean you can dictate every detail, but it does give you a more specific basis for questions and contract language. Over time, that kind of conversation encourages an ecosystem where transparency about dependencies is normal rather than rare. For many organizations, the most realistic starting point, or quick win, is to choose one or two high-value applications and add SBOM generation to their existing build pipelines. That limited scope still gives meaningful visibility where it matters most, without overwhelming teams with a massive project. As time goes on, a more strategic use is to aggregate SBOM data across many applications. That larger view can highlight patterns, such as a heavy reliance on a single library across dozens of systems, or clusters of applications that all depend on components that are hard to patch. Those patterns then inform architecture and refactoring decisions.
When teams take SBOM work seriously, the most obvious benefit is visibility. Instead of a vague statement that your organization uses a lot of open source, you can point to specific components and versions tied to real services. That clarity supports faster vulnerability response, better vendor and third-party risk conversations, and more grounded technical planning. It also helps non-technical leaders understand that software supply chain risk is something you can describe and measure, not just worry about.
The benefits come with trade-offs. Generating SBOM documents at scale means touching build pipelines and adjusting developer workflows. New tools or plugins may be needed. Someone has to own the work of storing, indexing, and maintaining SBOM information so it does not quietly become stale. Security and IT teams need to learn how to interpret SBOM data without drowning in it. There can also be cultural friction if developers see SBOM work as pure overhead rather than an extension of responsible delivery. All of this requires time, skills, and some investment.
There are also real limits to what SBOM data can show. An SBOM reflects what your tooling can see and what your processes capture. It may miss components that are loaded dynamically at runtime, custom binaries, or dependencies that are poorly documented. It does not expose design flaws, weak access controls, or unsafe deployment practices. The SBOM tells you what ingredients are in the dish, but not whether they were prepared safely or served to the right people. That is why it needs to sit alongside, not replace, broader work on secure design and operations.
When SBOM efforts go wrong, the patterns are familiar. A common failure mode is to treat SBOM as a one-time compliance project. A team generates a few SBOM documents to satisfy a mandate, stores them in a forgotten location, and never connects them to vulnerability management or change processes. Another anti-pattern is assigning all SBOM work to a single person with no clear role for development or operations. In those settings, SBOM becomes a side task, not a shared practice, and it rarely influences real decisions.
Shallow adoption has other telltale signs. SBOM data is never cross-referenced with actual systems or tickets. When a new vulnerability arrives, the organization still cannot answer, "Are we affected?" any faster than before. You might find duplicated or conflicting SBOM records for the same application, and inconsistent naming that makes searches unreliable. Dashboards exist, but they are static, and no one relies on them. In short, the SBOM is technically present, but is not trusted enough to guide action. Healthy SBOM practice looks very different. When a new vulnerability appears, teams can quickly pull a list of affected applications, their owners, and the specific components involved. Tickets reference particular versions and entries from SBOM documents, not just free text notes. Architecture reviews include explicit questions about dependency choices and concentration risk, supported by SBOM summaries. Over time, metrics such as the time to identify affected assets and the time from advisory to patch decision improve. Leaders hear concrete, evidence-backed answers instead of guesses about exposure. Those are strong signals that SBOM information and software supply chain thinking have moved from theory into everyday work. At its heart, a software bill of materials is about making software supply chain risk concrete enough to manage. It gives you a way to see what is really inside your applications and how those components and dependencies connect across your environment. When you combine SBOM practice with solid engineering and operational habits, noisy vulnerability headlines and bold vendor claims turn into specific questions with specific answers. A practical next step is to pick one important application and ask a simple question. If a key library in this stack turned out to be vulnerable tomorrow, how quickly could we find every place it lives and decide what to do? Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.